This is a walkthrough of the terrain deformation shader made in Unreal Engine 5.6. There are three main materials that the user can alter in order to achieve their desired results. One of them being a material parameter collection. This controls the overall world and how the trail will be affected within the world. And then the other one being a material instance for the different landscape heights. As seen here, there are 4 different materials in a landscape: stone, soil, sand, and snow. And these heights can be affected to different variations within this material instance. And the last material instance, being called landscape deformation, just affects how the trail is changed, contorted, what colors are beneath the trail as you're walking, etc., etc. Now, starting with a material parameter collection, the first parameter the user will be greeted by is dubbed global matter height. Now, this parameter adjusts the maximum height for all the materials within the level. As seen earlier, there are different heights for the materials. This is what sets the precedent. So, currently it's at a base level of 30. Adjusting this to a level of 70, a visual increase can be seen, where even the trails beforehand are altered by this change. Snow being the highest, sand being the second highest, and soil being the lowest. Now, bringing this back to a value of 30, going to the next parameter, trail fade. Now, this value is adjusted within an unorthodox range of 0.97 and 0.9 recurring if a fade wants to be seen, or a value of 1, which it's currently at if the user wishes to just have their trail memorized as they go along. So changing this to the fastest value of 0.97 will show near instantaneous results. As can be seen here, the trail was memorized for a short while before eventually just completely dissipating. Now, setting this to a value of 0.9999, being the lowest value where the user can still see gradual change, pressing F8 to go back to the playable view. The user can walk around for a little bit, and then after, say, 30 seconds or so, the trail should catch back up with the user. A closer look at this will allow for the user to be able to see the gradual rising of the trail. It's very, very gradual, so it allows for the user to maintain immersion whilst also having the ability to optimize their trails. Now, as for the last parameter, resetting the trail fade back to 1 will also get rid of the trail fade immediately. Now, going to the last parameter of trail width, this is adjusted between a value of 0 and 5, where 0 shows no trail whatsoever, and a value of 5 will make a trail that is 5 times the size of the mesh. So, starting with the largest value, trail width of 5. Now, walking around with this trail fade of 5, there's an obvious large trail wherever the user's mesh is going. This could go as far as to affect the jump height of this mesh, where the trail will show up a bit earlier, or depending on where the mesh is relative to the ground, will just appear wherever the user's jumping. And to make for a more tighter trail, a value of 0.7 is recommended, where the user can walk around and see very close indents of their footprints if they're using a mesh that's walking at is. And it can be tracked to a higher degree of accuracy, even in deep materials such as snow. Now, that's it for the material parameter collection. I'm going to set these values back to default and move on to landscape heights, where the different heights of the materials within levels can be adjusted. Now, as I said earlier, this is dependent on the maximum height of the global matter height parameter within the material parameter collection. This is done by having these separate material heights as fractions of the maximum height. So for muds, it's a quarter of the maximum height as seen in the global matter height. Same thing for sand. Snow has the maximum height judged by the value of 1, and stone does not take from the height of the material parameter collection, given that it's not a deformable material. So walking around on snow or otherwise will produce the desired results, whereas going on to stone and other such flat matter will refrain from showing such deformation. Now these can be adjusted to whatever the user would like. For example, changing this mud height over here from a value of 0.25 to value of 1. Walking on over. As you can see, the mud height has also been affected. Now, onto the last material instance of this shader. This is the landscape deform material instance, where the trail is mainly affected. So, starting with these switches, since these can give the user different parameters and even more switches further on, as well as the ability to choose different materials, so on and so forth. So starting with the custom trail normal, enabling that will allow for the users to have the option to change the trail normal to whatever they wish. For the sake of example, this has been changed to the stone normal here. And as you can see, along the trail and just the trail, the normal has changed to something that's more jarring, more jagged, and more obviously not going with what the landscape is. Now, in order to adjust the intensity of this, because different normals can have different amounts of visibility, there's this custom trail normal intensity value that only appears whenever the custom trail normal switch has been enabled. That and the independent normals trail tiling, which obviously adjusts the tiling of the normals within the trails. So as for custom trail normal intensity, this can be adjusted between the values of 1 and 5, with 5 having the least amount of intensity, as observed here, whereas saying it's a value of 1 will achieve more defined results such as these. This is truly up to user preference, and it can be applied in any scenario, and the normals are really flexible. Changing, for example, to this bright desert normal, you can see sandy indents within the trail. And to note, these normals in this trail affect all the materials within the level. So there's not as much variety as far as the trails go. It's just more of the functionality that is to be showed off here. Now there's the tiling too, and now turning this back to a value of 5 makes them less harsh. Okay, so disabling this to bring the normals back to the way they were, there is a trail normal intensity for the regular normals that come from the landscape material that is being deformed. Currently sets a value of 2. They can be adjusted all the way up to a value of 5, where the same thing occurs, less intensity, more intensity. And this is capped at a value of 5. So bring that down to 3. There is also the trail shadow with no texture, which branches off of my explanation for the next switch here. So when this switch is disabled, as it is right now, the user has the option to adjust the amount of shading within their trails as is, without any texture underneath the trail. So this is set by the red value of the trail mask. So no matter what color is chosen, it will just appear as a darker variation of what's in the landscape. So going from, say, blue, it's just more of a darker color as opposed to the blue vibrancy that is there on the offset. And this affects the shading across all of the materials in the landscape, but it is tailored to how light the materials are within the landscape. So setting this to a darker value of black right here, as can be seen here, it fits the mud really well. However, say for something like snow or sand, it might be too intense. But as can be seen here, since it's set to the red value of whatever material is present, it doesn't look too starkly contrasting in the way that the darkness appears. And then within sand and snow, similar values. And since snow and sand are much lighter than the mud, the shadows don't appear as intensely as they would have in mud. They are still quite intense, but not as intense as what mud would have been. So that's the option for when the different texture for trail is disabled. However, when this switch is enabled, The user has the option to choose whatever material they want to fill in the trail as they go along. Again, this does affect the trail across all materials in the landscape, but it can be adjusted to the user's liking. This again is also adjusted depending on what material is in the landscape by the red mask. So for materials such as the mud, where previously it would have appeared as a jarring contrast between the really light stone and the really dark mud, this has been adjusted so that the stone doesn't appear to have that much of a contrast between the mud. The normals also make a big difference with this. And pairing with the normals, the user also has the option to enable custom trail normals, and then also another switch will reveal itself in the title of "Is common normal tiling same as custom texture tiling?" Enabling this will allow for the tiling of the texture and of the normals to sync, so that the user won't have to worry about adjusting the tiling values individually. So no matter what the material tiling is and no matter what the normal tiling is, there's only one parameter to adjust in order to change both of these in sync. The last switch is dubbed layering on. Now this does just as it says, it layers the materials within the landscape, as you can see here. Big difference between the stark, just single footprint going from 0 to 1. It adds a sense of layering where the user can go over the trail multiple times until they reach the very bottom of the material. This is extremely effective in materials such as snow. We're walking on over to here. So the feet of this mesh will not immediately indent the snow, though it does take just a few instances of walking over this trail. It does add another level of immersion that allows for the user to interact further with the landscape. This was an addition made as part of a suggestion of the user testing feedback, and it's not a parameter that can be adjusted by itself. It is affected by other outside parameters. What other parameters are they, you might ask? Well, that takes us to the landscape render mask section. So in this section, the user can adjust the layering intensity here, which is from values of 0 to 1. Setting it's a value of 1 will give the user the most deepest indents where layering is concerned. However, this does depend on another parameter called build up around trail. Now, when this parameter is set to 0, layering is most intense. Setting this parameter to a value of 2 will make the layering less intense. This essentially improves the intensity of the edges around the trail or where the indentation is involved. See, setting it to a value of 2 will make it so that the walls of the deformation are more refined. Setting this to a value of 0 makes it so that they're less refined and it looks like the snow is kind of collapsing in on itself. Putting it back to a value of 1. This effect is best seen when the layering is turned off, which I plan to do in a minute after showing yet another parameter that affects the amount of layering that occurs, the trail intensity parameter. Now, these parameters are interlinked in the sense that if the build up around trail parameter is higher than this one, a certain effect happens. However, I will go over that in just a minute. Just to show for the sake of example how this would affect layering, I will turn this back to 0, where layering is at its most intense, but then doing this, changing the trail intensity from a value of 3.8 to a value of, say, 2, will make the layering even more intense. A value of 3.8 is recommended, though, if you wish to interact with the environment so as to go all the way to the floor. Right, so turning this off and then going back to the build up around trail, this is where the effect really shines. So turning this to a value of 1.6, as can be seen here, there's a little ridge over where the trails are. It adds a bit of build up, so it would seem, around the footprints or around wherever the mesh is deforming. A value of 1.6 appears quite intense, however. This value operates within the bounds of 0 and 5. 5 being a really high value that distorts the trails. However, the value of 1 really just adds that subtle effect that boosts how snow would look and is recommended. Now, as to how the value of the build-up around trail and the trail intensity are interlinked, now, if this value of trail intensity is higher than build-up around trail, the build-up around trail will require a higher parameter in order to have a more intense effect. As can be seen here, the trail intensity is affected in the range of 1 to 10, by the way. 10 being the most intense, and the value of 1 being the least intense. It can go down to 0, but at that point, no trail is really observed, and it's not worth it. So, saying this a value of 10, as can be seen here, that build-up around trail parameter doesn't appear to have that much of an effect as it did previously. This would have to go up to a value of 5 or value of 3 to overcompensate for the fact that the trail intensity is now changed. However, setting this down to a value of 1, where the build-up around trail is set to a value of 3, the build-up around trail does appear more intense, but there is an effect underlying this that also appears. As can be seen here, within the trail, there's a small amount of build-up where the user went over the same area again and again. Now, though this isn't an intentional feature, I imagine the user, depending on the circumstances, could have their uses for it. So I've kept it in as a way to provide more creative flexibility. Now, that covers these two parameters. The user can adjust them to bring them back to their default values, obviously. There's the value of max depth. Now, this affects how far down the feet of the mesh can go and then caps it at that value. Right now, it's at a value of 1 because the parameter can be affected between the values of 0 and 1. 1 being the lowest it can go, 0 being no deformation whatsoever. So, saying it's a value of 0.5, for example, this would be the maximum that the feet can go down. It will reach up to the ankles and that's it. It will cap out. This can be better seen if you look under the virtual height mesh. They caps out under here and the feet are submerged. This works well in combination with the trail fade parameter. Say if the user has heavy snow in their level and they don't wish for the user's feet to be able to reach the ground so quickly as they do, this can be set to a value of 0.999. If the user were to walk around where the footsteps have been capped, it will look like those footsteps are being filled in. And since the footsteps don't go as far down as they would have with layering on or with just a set max depth of 1, it provides the immersion that there's heavy snow. Hence the reason why max depth is a parameter. Now, saying this back to the value of 1, feet go back down and snow doesn't look as softly indented. Moving on to trail resolution, it's, as it says, changes how high quality the trail would be, with the value of 0.01 being the highest amount of quality that this trail is at. However, these do operate in the bounds of 0.001 and 0.01. So saying it's a lowest value of 0.001, we'll see that the trail isn't as smoothed out and is more pixelated, if anything. This will be good for certain unique styles that the user could have to their level, provides more versatility where that is regarded. This does affect all of the materials within the level. However, if it is a stylistic choice, this would be preferred. Now, saying this back to the value of 0.01, showing the smoothest trails, the last value here is trail rigidness, operating within the bounds of 0 and... yes, okay. So the last parameter here would be trail rigidness, adds noise around the edge. This provides parameters in the range of 0 and 1. 1 being the most intense and 0 having none whatsoever, as seen throughout the whole of this video presentation. So saying this to a value of 0.5, does add a little bit of rigidness around the edges, saying it's a value of 1, does add a little bit more rigidness towards the edges. Now, it is a subtle effect. However, it does add a new, unique style and look to the footprints that adds a sense of ruggedness to every step that is made. And that will conclude the usability of the Trail Deformation shader. I myself am impressed with how visually it looks, and users have stated they are also impressed with how visually it looks. They also have stated that they enjoy the versatility that this shader provides with all the different parameters, the different choices the user could make. However, for future reference, I feel as though to make it further more versatile, to have parameters and materials and such that affect only certain materials within the landscape. For example, having it so that only a certain amount of layering could be applied to mud, or only a certain amount of layering can be applied to sand, for example, to make it more that the landscape is more diverse and the user can use it for a wider use case. And it could also be noted that during user testing, users didn't really know how the parameters worked. So there was a lot of contention as to how things should increase, and sometimes the shader would break. To curb this, and to make for a more cleaner appearance in the user material instance, I made it so that there is clamping in effect for many of these parameters, as to avoid any points of breaking the shader and making it more usable for those who aren't very well versed with Unreal Engine or have not read the technical documentation. There is also technical documentation as part of this to make it easier for the user to use. It can also be noted that through the production of this shader, there was a lighting issue where day and night cycles were previously not possible due to the shading of the trails being affected by the angle that the directional light. So say, for example, if the directional light was on the opposite side of the landscape, say right here, the normals would appear inverted and the colors would be a stark white to the point where it didn't look like trails. And to curb this and to fix this error, I've created a material function called MF Lighting Fix that detects which direction the directional light is in and adjusts accordingly based on that. So this shader is fully compatible with day-night cycles now, with this in mind. So having directional light at whatever point down here. And as part of this, the intensity of the shading in the trails is also affected. So the lower down the directional light, the more intense the shading is between the trails, which is a nice quality of life visual look to the trails. So say if the user further wishes to use this on other meshes within the level, or has an AI that could also affect deformation within the landscape. Well, the good thing about this shader is that it only affects the deformation within a set... The good thing about this shader is that deformation is only seen within the set bounds of the player. So, going over to the example ball over here, if I were to kick this around and such, and it were to go out of bounds, the deformation of that ball is not recorded. However, to go back in bounds of the ball, the deformation can now be seen. So in terms of optimization, in terms of how efficient the shader can be, when in a large world where many meshes can affect deformation and many other AI can affect deformation, don't expect it to impact performance as it regularly would. For deformation is only seen within set bounds of the player, as seen here.